For over 300 years, humans had been known across the stars as the quiet peacekeepers of the galactic conquered. Among 72 alien civilizations, they were respected for their calm nature, their deep patience, and their ability to resolve even the most impossible conflicts without ever firing a weapon. While other species brought strength, speed, or science to the Concord, humans brought something rarer: restraint. They were called the gentle giants of Sol, not just for their tall frames and soft voices, but for the way they seemed to carry centuries of wisdom behind every word. That reputation was what brought Ambassador Ellen Juno to the edge of known space, to a station orbiting the unstable border between the Threx Dominion and the Solari Accord. The summit was meant to cool a rising conflict before it turned into a full war. The Threx, a proud reptilian species with a long history of military dominance, had grown tired of Solari trade expansions. The Solari, graceful amphibious thinkers, refused to back down, and in the middle of their ancient hate stood a single human woman in a gray diplomatic robe, speaking with measured tone and unshaken posture as if she held all the time in the universe. While speeches echoed in the main chamber, far from the public eye, another human presence watched silently from a forgotten docking ring on the station's far side. A small freighter, boxy and rusted at the edges, drifted without fanfare, its registration unremarkable, its name simple: the Selene 7. Inside, 7 humans worked in silence, reviewing communication logs, monitoring station power patterns, and tracking movements across every hallway. They didn't wear uniforms. They didn't carry weapons. To any outsider, they would look like traders, maybe engineers. But they weren't here to trade. They were here to see what others would miss. Among them was Layla Cortez, an aging systems analyst with tired eyes that had seen too much, and Reese Morgan, a quiet linguist who barely spoke even to his own team. No orders were spoken. They worked like gears in a clock, precise, focused, and waiting for something they hadn't yet named. The crew's attention sharpened when a coded pulse blinked through the Threx diplomatic channel. It was just one signal, half a second long, almost too quick to catch. But it wasn't part of official communication. Layla narrowed her eyes, rewound the data, and looked again. The code matched an old format, one used during covert operations in the Orion Rebellion decades ago. Reese didn't speak, but he nodded slowly. It was a signal meant for a hidden fleet, not for diplomacy. They sent the findings through a private relay, one that ended at Ellen Juno's personal AI system. And then, they waited. Back in the main chamber, Ellen Juno continued speaking to both sides with soft words and even softer eyes. She acknowledged the history of each civilization, offered small compromises, and asked that they consider a cooling period before trade restrictions were enforced. The Threx ambassador blinked slowly, his body language calm, but there was something behind his voice now, something colder, more practiced. The Solari delegates felt it too, but they looked to Ellen, who gave no sign of worry. She smiled, even thanked the Threx for their honest dialogue. Around her, the other alien delegates nodded, once again amazed at how the humans remained calm no matter what pressure they faced. But the Selene 7 knew something had shifted. The Threx had made their move. Not a loud one, but a small, careful step that could set off a chain of events far deadlier than any open threat. Yet Ellen did nothing. She didn't raise the alarm. She didn't break protocol. And that was when Reese whispered something no one wanted to say aloud. She's waiting. Not for proof, not for approval, for the right moment. Because if humanity had mastered anything in its long journey through the stars, it was this: when you move too soon, you become the aggressor. But when you wait long enough, the galaxy shows you who your enemies really are. As the summit continued, subtle cracks began to form in the fragile peace that Ellen Juno had worked so carefully to maintain. The Threx, who had once made their living through military conquest, began to quietly sabotage the very diplomatic channels that were supposed to keep the peace. Communication systems were compromised. Key supply lines vanished, and entire trade routes blinked out of existence without explanation. The Solari, with their delicate aquatic minds, could only scramble to respond, losing key stations on the FI edge of the border. In the corridors of power, the alarm bells rang, but to the surprise of many, the humans did nothing. The galaxy's greatest peacekeepers remained silent. They watched, they listened, but they did not intervene. The decision was strange. Humans were never this passive, were they? Was this a new strategy, or had they always been this way? Among the many alien species observing the summit was Tyr Vax, a sharp-eyed analyst from the Kareel, an insectoid, race known for their ability to observe and analyze patterns. For decades, Tyr had admired humanity's ability to stay neutral, to keep their emotions under control. They saw humans as a symbol of patience, a species that, despite their relatively recent rise to prominence, had mastered the art of waiting. But now, something didn't feel right. The Threks were making clear moves, and the humans seemed unbothered by the collapse of the peace process. It wasn't just that Ellen Juno wasn't reacting, it was as if she didn't even see the storm brewing. It was as if she had already seen it, long before it arrived. Tyr's suspicion deepened, and they began to quietly dig into humanity's past. They interviewed retired human soldiers, old veterans who had fought in the great wars of humanity's history. The interviews were strange. None of the soldiers spoke with bitterness, nor did they seem haunted by their past. They spoke kindly, almost warmly, about the missions they had completed, and yet there was something about them that felt off. It wasn't their words, it was their eyes. They spoke of battles won not with force, but with patience, precision, and strategy. They mentioned things like outlasting their enemies, wearing them down. The way they described it, it was like they were speaking of a quiet storm that had taken years to build, a storm that would break only when the time was right. Yet, Ellen Juno remained the picture of diplomacy. She appeared oblivious to the escalating tensions around her. Each day she spoke calmly and with grace, never losing her composure. It was almost as if she was waiting for the entire galaxy to play its hand. The alien delegates watched, her with growing confusion. What did she know that they did not? Was she really as naive as she appeared, or was there something deeper at play? Meanwhile, the Selene 7, the unassuming freighter crew that had been watching the summit from the shadows, made a quiet shift in position. No one noticed. They didn't appear on the star charts, and their movements were as subtle as the silence between Ellen's words. The freighter crew wasn't looking for answers. They had already found them. They were simply waiting for the right moment to act. They moved in absolute silence, a perfect mirror of humanity's long-standing approach to conflict. It was a strategy so deeply ingrained in their culture that it was almost invisible, even to those who were watching for it. Tyr's investigations continued. They dug deeper into the archives, into the oldest military records and diplomatic agreements. And that's when they found it. Something buried beneath layers of history, something that had been almost forgotten. A document, an ancient order. Directive Patience, Operation Quiet Tide. It was old, over 200 years old, but it was clear and chilling in its purpose. The directive outlined a strategy that humans had adopted long ago, a strategy of complete, controlled patience. In it, humans promised to never strike first. Instead, they would wait, watching, listening, observing, until their enemies became too tired to fight, too weak to defend themselves. It was a strategy of enduring calm, of making the galaxy forget the true power that lay in wait. And when the time was right, when their enemies had stretched too far, humanity would strike not with a weapon, but with a presence so overwhelming, that no one could ignore it. Tiervax read the document with a growing sense of dread. It was so precise, so detailed. It was as if the humans had been preparing for this moment for centuries. They had never been peacemakers in the way others thought. They had been patient killers, watching as the galaxy danced on the edge of war, knowing that when it came time to act, they would do so in a way no one would expect. Slowly, the pieces of the puzzle fell into place. It wasn't about negotiation. It was about control. And the humans had already won, without firing a single shot. The growing tension at the summit could no longer be ignored. As Ellen Juno continued, her calm negotiation, one voice rose in suspicion. Tiervax, the Kariel analyst who had been quietly studying humanity's every move, decided to confront her directly. Their long, thin fingers drummed nervously on the table, the insectoid figure standing tall before the human ambassador. "You're manipulating us," Tyr accused, their voice clear and steady, but filled with a strange sense of disbelief. "You and your people have been playing us all along. How long have you been planning this? How long have you been waiting?" Ellen didn't flinch. She didn't even raise an eyebrow. Instead, she regarded the Kariel with the same patient calmness that had become her trademark. "Do you think peace was simply given to this galaxy?" she asked, her tone soft, but pointed. The question hung in the air like a challenge. Tyr blinked, momentarily stunned. They had been looking for a sign of guilt, of deceit. But what they found instead was something even more unsettling. Ellen wasn't defending herself. She was only asking a question, as if she already knew the answer. Suddenly, flashes of humanity's past came to the forefront of Tyr's mind. The ancient archives, the forgotten wars that had shaped Earth's rise. Humanity's history wasn't one of grand victories or decisive battles. It was the history of survival, of knowing when to strike and perhaps more importantly, when to wait. Earth's strategy had never been to fire first. In every major conflict, humans had watched, waited, and then, when others had exhausted themselves, they had finished what had been started. It wasn't the story of aggressors, but of patient killers, quiet, relentless, and always a step ahead. Wars had been ended not with overwhelming force, but with isolation, with sabotage, with misdirection. Humanity had perfected the art of patience, knowing that, in the end, the only thing more powerful than a battle was knowing when not to fight at all. As these thoughts began to settle in Tyr's mind, back on the Selene 7, the crew was making their own move. In the dark, quiet recesses of the Threx communications network, they had found a weakness. With a few expertly placed commands, they disabled one of the Threx Dominion's most vital command relays. The ripple effect was immediate. Diplomatic channels flickered, information went dark, and crucial military transmissions were lost. For a brief moment, it seemed as if the entire station had become paralyzed. Panic spread through the Threx ranks. But no one saw a human hand in it. No one saw them. The Selene 7 was a ghost ship, a silent observer that had now caused an entire diplomatic process to grind to a halt without leaving a trace. It wasn't a direct attack. It didn't need to be. The humans weren't visible, but their influence was undeniable. The sabotage wasn't the endgame. It was a reminder. A signal that humanity's patience had limits, and that every action, no matter how small, was part of a grand, calculated strategy. The Threx might have thought themselves in control, but the humans had always known that the true power came from the unseen hand, the one that quietly shaped events from the shadows. Back in the high chambers of the Threx, the ripple of confusion was beginning to make waves. Threx commanders scrambled to restore the communications network, but it was clear they had underestimated their human counterparts. They were no longer fighting for control of the summit. They were fighting for control of something much larger, something they hadn't even recognized until now. And it was too late. In a dark corner of the Threx command station, Admiral Korak, the highest-ranking officer in the Dominion, stood alone in front of his private console. His sharp reptilian eyes narrowed as he reviewed the sabotage reports. Something about the timing, the method, and the quiet precision struck him with an eerie familiarity. It wasn't just the sabotage that felt like a signature. It was the way it had been done, with a kind of patience that was, frankly, unsettling. Korak had studied every major conflict in galactic history, and there was only one race that could pull off something like this: humanity. The tactic was so old, so subtle, that he almost couldn't believe it. For a moment, Korak's mind flashed back to the archives of his youth, to tales of an ancient human strategy, one so long forgotten that it had faded into legend. Quiet Tide, they had called it. A tactic that had been used to wear down entire fleets, entire empires, without ever firing a shot. Korak knew the danger now. Humanity wasn't just playing the game, they were the ones who had made the rules. With a low hiss, Korak turned off his console and vanished from the public channels. His disappearance was not an accident. The last Threx admiral to recognize the human strategy had been swiftly silenced, and Korak knew the cost of that recognition all too well. A whisper had been heard. The storm was coming, and the galaxy would never look at humanity the same way again. It didn't take long for the Threx dominion to unravel. The once powerful empire, which had long dominated the edge of the galaxy, with its military strength, began to crumble in less than a month. It started small. Supply lines were mysteriously disrupted. Entire fleets left stranded without resources. Communications between their homeworld and colonies started to fail. As the weeks passed, civil unrest bloomed across the Dominion. Citizens, who had once stood firm behind their rulers, began to question everything, from their leadership to the very cause they had been fighting for. Soon, smaller factions, many of them once oppressed by the Threx's iron grip, began to declare their independence. The whole of the Dominion began to fracture, splintering under the pressure of unseen forces. The Threx military, once an imposing force, seemed unable to act. Every time they made a move, it was countered, always by unknown parties, always ahead of their efforts. Strategic positions were lost hours before they were even occupied, and supply convoys were intercepted just as they were about to reach their destination. It was as if the Dominion was being watched, not by one force, but by 1,000. Every plan, every military advance they made, was turned back before it could even begin. Yet, no one ever saw the humans. No ships, no soldiers, no weapons. Just the steady, crushing force of their influence, moving like a shadow in the dark, among. The chaos, one ship, the Selene 7, moved silently through the galaxy. Always in the background, never drawing attention, always just out of sight. The crew worked in absolute silence, as they had always done. They didn't need to fight to win. They just had to be patient, and the Threx would eventually destroy themselves. The humans had spent centuries preparing for this. They didn't need to fire a single shot to make it happen. As the collapse grew more apparent, the Threx Chancellor, once a proud and defiant leader, sent a final, desperate plea to the humans. The message was sent to Ellen Juno, hoping for an explanation, an apology, anything to stop the unraveling of his empire. The Threx had been playing a dangerous game, pushing their boundaries too far, too fast. They had miscalculated, believing that humanity's calm demeanor was weakness. But they were wrong. Now, with the Dominion on the brink of total collapse, the Chancellor needed answers. Ellen received the transmission in her usual composed manner. She had known this moment would come, the time when the Threx would realize they had underestimated the humans. She listened to the Chancellor's plea, and when the time came for her response, she spoke softly, but with a certainty that left no room for doubt. "We warned you not to mistake mercy for weakness," she said, her words clear and final. We are slow to anger, but slower to forget. In that moment, the full weight of her words sank into the galaxy. The truth was terrifying. For centuries, humanity had been preparing for this exact moment. They had never stopped preparing for war. They had only been waiting for others to forget how good they were at it. The galaxy had grown complacent, assuming that humanity's reputation as peaceful diplomats meant they had lost their edge. They had forgotten that humans had mastered the art of patience. They had forgotten that when humanity chose to act, it wasn't with reckless abandon, but with absolute precision. And when the time came to strike, they would do so without a single shot fired, without a single soldier in sight. The rest of the galaxy could no longer deny the truth. What they had once thought was humanity's kindness, their peaceful nature, was actually their greatest weapon. It was not weakness, but an incredible strength, a patience that could outlast any force in the galaxy. The humans had never been the ones to start wars, but they had always been the ones to finish them. And now, with the Threx Dominion on the edge of collapse, the galaxy was forced to acknowledge that the humans had been in control the entire time. They had been waiting, watching, and now the storm was upon them. As the Threx military crumbled, the rest of the galaxy looked on in stunned silence. What had once seemed impossible, a fractured, crumbling empire brought to its knees without a single shot fired, had become a brutal reminder. Humanity had never been weak. They had simply been waiting for everyone else to forget. And now, as the dust settled over the ruins of the Threx Dominion, one thing was certain: the galaxy would never see humanity the same way again. The galaxy was still reeling from the fall of the Threx Dominion. A once mighty empire had disintegrated so swiftly, its military and political structures crumbling beneath the weight of unseen forces. The other alien nations, once too cautious to question humanity's methods, were now left in stunned silence, wondering just how they had missed it. Had they been blind to humanity's true strength for all these years? Were the Threx the first, or had others made similar miscalculations? The consequences of the humans' patient strategy were impossible to ignore now. Amidst the chaos, the leaders of the Solari, the very species that had been caught in the wake of the Threx's aggression, took the first step toward reconciliation. Their ambassadors, once hesitant and suspicious, now offered a formal apology to Ellen Juno and humanity. They admitted their mistake in thinking humanity's restraint was a sign of weakness, not wisdom. The apology was public, humble, and heartfelt. They had witnessed firsthand the cost of underestimating the humans, and now they sought to make amends. But Ellen Juno's response was not what they expected. She declined the war reparations that the Solari had offered. It wasn't their gold, or resources that humanity sought, but something far more important. With the same calm resolve that had marked her every action throughout the crisis, Ellen simply said, "Remember this day, not with fear, but with understanding. We are not your enemies, unless you force us to be." Her words rang out across the galaxy, carrying with them a sense of finality. There was no malice in her voice, no threat, only the unmistakable certainty that humanity had been pushed to the brink, and now the galaxy knew better than to make the same mistake again. It wasn't a warning, it was a reminder. The lesson was clear. Humanity had always been peaceful, but they were also patient, and when pushed too far, they would never forget. As the galaxy began to adjust to the new reality, Tirvax, the Kirill analyst who had first suspected humanity's true nature, published their report. Titled "The Patient Killers of Earth," it chronicled humanity's rise to power through their unmatched patience, their ability to endure and outlast, and their carefully orchestrated moves that had brought down the Threx Dominion without a single battle being fought. The report spread like wildfire across the galaxy, shaking the foundations of military doctrine in many alien nations. Leaders who had once considered humanity soft, even weak, now reconsidered their own strategies. The galaxy was forced to face a hard truth. Humanity had never stopped preparing for war. They had simply chosen not to fight unless they had to. Henny. The months that followed, the peace talks continued, but there was a new respect in the room. The human delegation, led by Ellen Juno, returned to their quiet place at the table, just as they had before. Calm, smiling, always watching. Their reputation had been forever altered, not through force, but through the steady, unrelenting pressure of patience. They were no longer seen as just peacekeepers. They were seen as something far more formidable, a species capable of waiting, observing, and when the time came, acting with precision and power. But for all the galaxy's newfound respect, the humans remained elusive. The Selene 7, the ship that had quietly caused so much disruption and change, vanished just as silently as it had appeared. There were no medals, no speeches, no public acknowledgement of the crew's role in the fall of the Threx. They left no trace, no traceable evidence that they had ever been there. Only one message was left behind, hidden in a private channel, accessible only to those who knew where to look. The message was brief, simple, and final. We don't need thanks. We just need time. And with that, humanity once again receded into the background, as it had done for centuries. Their influence was felt, but they were no longer at the forefront of the galaxy's political stage. They had done what was necessary, and nothing more. The storm had passed, and the galaxy was left to wonder what would come next. Would humanity ever be forced to act again? Or would they continue to wait, watching patiently, knowing that the galaxy would never forget the lesson they had taught? That humanity was not to be underestimated, not ever again.